What's up, y'all? I'm Yancey Strickler, and welcome to the Idea Space. The name of this show comes from a phrase by the graphic novelist Alan Moore. He called the mysterious place where ideas come from the Idea Space, a place so powerful it could transcend and even transform the physical world. I first read about this idea in an amazing book by the writer John Higgs about the band the KLF. In that book, Higgs explores the group's crazy decision to burn £1 million, almost all their money, and how this was perhaps inspired by something like the Idea Space. John's other books are equally mind-altering. I've been fortunate to get to know John the past few years. After he read my book, This Could Be Our Future, he sent me a magazine dedicated to pictures of people burning money. This is the kind of friend he is. To have John Higgs, in many ways the namesake of my newsletter and this show, as our first guest is the thing of dreams. But I have to warn you that I was so excited to catch up with John that I completely forgot about production value, which is not the best. But John's ideas exploring metamodernism, the rise of empathy, new concepts of individualism, and who really broke up the Beatles more than make up for it. You know, I think it was the first time we met, we were having lunch in London, and you told me you were working on a book about William Blake. And this book, William Blake versus the World, is coming out in a few months, right? Comes out in 2021.
In May, yeah.
And during that conversation, I asked you if you thought people had always been fundamentally the same. I was like, are people always people? Do you look back at William Blake and think, oh, he's just like a person and like one of us today, just in that period of time instead?
Yeah.
And your answer was no. You thought people were very different. And I wonder if you remember that conversation and, what you think about that now.
Yeah, I don't. I probably now say that in some ways people are the same, but culture changes. And the extent to which what we think of us as our personalities is in fact just a bolt-on from the wider world. That's constantly shifting, and that's sort of constantly changing. I mean, people are always, foolish and smart and clever and stupid and cruel and nasty, and all those things are a general sort of baseline. But there's a lot of. I just read a book called The Five by. I think her name was Hallie. I'd have to look up her name, but it's about the victims of the Jack the Ripper murders, and it's brilliant. It's just one of those books that's so well written. She just brings these five women completely to life. They've become so vivid and real that the idea that you'd want to read about the person who killed them just goes out the window. It's just a fantastic book. But I was just thinking, this book could have been written 10 years ago or 50 years ago. It could have been written 100 years ago. The information was just out there. But it needed someone to sort of come along and say, no, what's interesting here is not this sort of shadowy person with a top hat and a knife in the fog, but it's the actual women, the five poor homeless women. That's where the story is. And to do that, she'd have to convince a publisher that that's what the story is. And the publisher would have to think, well, the book-buying audience would have to buy into that. It involves a sort of a greater sort of circle of empathy than would have been around if you were writing books about Jack the Ripper in the 1970s or the 1990s or something like that. So it's just another example of the changes that have been happening really, really quickly and rapidly in culture. What seems normal to us now, but of course those five women are what's interesting about that thing. It wasn't like that really not so long ago. Things like that are constantly changing.
Do you have a sense, you say these things are changing so quickly. Do you think they're changing more quickly than before? Is this a constant? Like if you go back and read, is Blake lamenting the world is changing too fast? I can't keep up with my email,
Yeah. Everyone throughout history laments that the world is changing too fast, and the point, just as they were born, was really that was the sweet spot. That's what we really want. But there are it's not a sort of smooth, even sort of level of change. There are moments when it's much more sort of visceral. And I think we've gone through one now. I think the 1960s was one as well. And certainly in Blake's time, the Age of Enlightenment, there's a whole bunch of new ideas just appear and just upend everything. So, I mean, change is the only constant there. But at some point, you just have to hold on a little bit more.
Yeah. So in The Future Starts Here, which it just got released in the U.S. for the first time recently, it came out in the U.K. a year ago. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't think it's been released in the US.
Oh, it hasn't been released in the US.
You can get it via Amazon, I'm sure, but it doesn't have an American publisher.
And so this is, I don't know what book number this is for you, 6? Who's counting?
9, I think.
9. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I apologize.
So until I was putting my little Blake book.
You're counting ahead.
The previous one, yeah.
And so it's a look ahead at the 21st century, and especially relating to some of your work in the past, which I want to get to in a minute. It's interesting, but you do talk a lot about change, generational change, and even a degree to which our existing pop culture has changed the way we look at it. You give a great example of The Breakfast Club, and sort of what that suggests. Can you share that story? Yeah,
I mean, it just came about. I just happened to watch The Breakfast Club with some members of, Generation Z, and being a member of Generation X, I was just the right age for The Breakfast Club, and we just thought, well, that's a classic. There was Johnny Depp's teen movies, that's a classic. And the millennials came along after us, and they liked it, and they sort of got it, and, it seemed, well, there you go, it's a classic. And then to sit down and watch it with a generation for whom it just makes no sense at all. It's just bewildering to them. For us, for Generation X, the authority figure, the principal, was the bad guy. He was the villain, and the kids bond in reaction to this authority figure. It made total sense. To them, he's just doing his job. He's not motivated by anything evil or cruel. In fact, he's had to come in at a weekend to try and make the school work better. So they don't see him, as this villain. But the character of Bender, played by, was it Judd Nelson?
Mm-hmm.
Who for us was the cool guy. He just did what he wanted. He was a real individual. He had that sort of taking no shit, sort of I will do what I want, rebel without a cause sort of thing. We were raised in a culture that said, that's cool, and that's great. That's the sort of person you should be. Imagine being someone like that. That's absolutely superb. And Generation Z look at him, and they're just horrified because, there's a scene where he's hiding under a table, and it's sort of where...
Molly Ringwald. He's inappropriate with Molly Ringwald, yeah.
And it very much suggests that he touches her inappropriately under the table. And it's just sort of played for laughs. And they just can't get over the fact that it's, he's sexually abused someone, and it's sort of played for laughs. And for them, the character that's the real hero, because that Judd Nelson character, he's cruel, he's nasty, he's not a good one at all. He's an arsehole. He's an absolute arsehole. But the nerd character, Brian, he gets the sympathy, because towards the end he sort of admits that he'd attempted suicide in the previous week. And it's sort of played for laughs because he did it with a flare gun.
Mm-hmm.
And the result is his parents are angry with him. He's been put into detention and things like that. And this is shocking to people watching it now, because that's the emotional sort of heart of this film. But when the film ends and you see Judd Nelson walking over the sort of football ground, and then he just sort of punches the air, and Simple Minds blast out, they're just like, what? How can that sort of be? It's just a generation has grown up to which values that seem so obvious to us, they just see them so much clearer. And the thing is, they're right. This is what gets me.
Right.
They're absolutely right. Judd Nelson, the character, is an arsehole. he shouldn't be the good guy. He shouldn't be the hero.
And in the book, you seem to suggest that maybe there was a point you don't directly connect it to Breakfast Club, but maybe we can track the point at which this mindset started to shift. Where, you point to many cultural shifts that happen around 2011, 2012 and the creation of the smartphone.
Yeah.
So, in a way you connect that to metamodernism, which I think is a great place to explore. But definitely you see a connection between phones and networks, and maybe for this Breakfast Club, you're saying a viewer today has a higher level of emotional or group intelligence to be able to recognize that this is messed up, rather than
a wider sort of circle of empathy.
Yeah.
Is the way I've sort of come to see it. The 20th century, especially the late 20th century, we all saw ourselves as these sort of individuals. That was the big thing. We've moved from this hierarchical sort of system in the 19th century where it really didn't matter what you were like, it was what your role was, whether you were a duke or whether you were a stable boy, or that was what mattered, It didn't sort of matter if you were funny or clever or something like that. But the late 20th century was definitely, individualism. That sort of thing is the individual that counts. That's the sense. But an individual is an isolated thing, and the more you focus on that way of seeing the world, the more sort of isolated you sort of become. Then this generation grows up with constant mobile internet access, and they're totally networked, and they understand immediately that the sense of them as an isolated individual does not explain who they are, or what they can do, or what they can achieve. They realise that their connections are as much part of them. It's what it's their networks, it's their relationships, it's their reputation. It's all these sort of things that are out in the world that allow them to be an individual. Their sense of individualism is still very strong, but it doesn't sort of end at the skin. They are sort of much more. And so they automatically think of the consequences of what they want to do on how it affects other people in a way that the pure individual of Judd Nelson in the Breakfast Club didn't give a shit. It was what he wanted to do. But the notion of, if I do this and it affects those people in that sort of way, and they will sort of react, that's just built in. That's just natural to them. That's how they sort of see the world. So they have a much more extended. It's not that they're not individuals anymore. They're not like sort of, Maoist clones all wearing the same clothes. It's not sort of a sense that everyone is identical or anything like that. The individual is perhaps stronger than ever before, but it recognises how connected it is.
Yeah, I think of it as post-individualism, where you take it as a given that everyone is an individual, we're all special. Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, well, actually the most interesting thing then is all the ways that we're similar. Yeah. It's actually, you quickly arrive at, wow, what a coincidence then that we have all these things in common as we're all individuals. And I feel like that is, like a key thing that you draw out from metamodernism is it's sort of it's a more utilitarian, perhaps, way of looking at the world, where you say there's an assumption that everything is flawed, but there's sort of a counter assumption that there is the possibility of value in everything, right? Yeah, so it's like it's a flattening, which is dangerous. A flattening is dangerous, but it is this sort of like everything is on this plane of, what's the saying? Every model is flawed, but some are useful. It's sort of viewing the world in that kind of way, right?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, it's metamodernism, or whatever name you want to choose for what has come after postmodernism. I think no one's saying that, hey, it's great and it's the perfect system, aren't we lucky to have it? But it is more a recognition that those are our assumptions now. That the perfect utopia isn't something to aim for, because that's not going to exist, But if something works for now, then hey, let's go with that. And if we can make things incrementally better slowly, then whatever works is more important than what's ideologically pure.
Do you see anything problematic in that? I mean, does that just seem common sense to you, or where do you see issues with that?
Well, it lends itself to the extreme. So this is the whole definition of metamodernism. It's not meta as we might understand it as self-referential. It comes from metaxi, a Greek word meaning the sort of the both poles. And so it tends to. So we've seen these swings to extreme positions. The sort of extreme right, extreme left have got sort of further apart. People have sort of gone out there in the belief that this would help, this would be a good thing, that this would make things better by going more and more on such things. And I think we could see quite easily the flaw there. And a lot more of my thought these days is into going beyond divisions. That seems to be the important sort of question for me in the 21st century, and especially here in Britain, because we're very much sort of divided into two countries. That sort of overflowing. So yeah, in some ways, I'd very much like to work out how to get beyond that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I want to talk about that. One thing I thought was interesting you point out is you talk about Viktor Frankl's man's search for meaning, and this notion that what drives people, it is a purpose in life. What helps you survive during the worst situation, it's purpose. And you point out that Frankl doesn't actually talk about having other people as being core. And Frankl's own purpose, in part, was his wife. It was his wife and his work. And I wonder, is it like, was community so assumed it wasn't even worth talking about? Was that like so deeply embedded it's like we don't even talk about it? Or was that the emergence of this new, like the new rational individualism? And I see a connection also in, I wrote in my own book a lot about Abraham Maslow and the hierarchy of needs, which was written in 1943. And in that paper, like, he talks nothing about money in any sort of way. Like, the idea that money is a need was not once mentioned or even alluded to. And it's like, okay, were these things really valued differently? Or is it just like, this is such basic stuff, it's not even worth talking about? What sense do you have?
I just get a sense that was a very 20th century take on the thing. And we're more aware of the sort of his lack of focus on others because we've just come out of that period of sort of intense isolated individualism. So it leaps out at us now. We always try and take good from the preceding generation, but we very quickly to spot where they've sort of gone wrong and sort of fix that bit and be all pleased with ourselves. But we rely on them far more, than we might otherwise think to ourselves. And there's so much good in Viktor Frankl in his writing. It's so helpful and so useful. It seems shameful to sort of criticize.
Yeah, no, you're not starting a rap beef here, to be clear. There's this, yes, no.
We're all for that.
Yeah, no, I mean, of course it's a beautiful book. But
we are aware that we do need others to find meaning, to find purpose. To me, the more I think about it, the more enthusiasm seems to be the key to life, to finding purpose. It doesn't matter what. Enthusiasm for anything, as long as there's enthusiasm for something, it's worthwhile.
You quote Blake writing that in the margins of something. Enthusiasm is all, right? What?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. He was criticising the great big art critical voice at the time, who was the head of the Royal Academy or something like that. Who just dismissed some works as just mere enthusiasm. It's just enthusiasm is the all. Blake is just such a wonderful thing to go back to now, especially in this pandemic year. He thought so differently to the standard 18th century and 19th century sort of way of thinking. That they just thought, well, there's no way I can follow what he's on about. He's just mad. He's just mad. Let's just completely ignore him. Once you get into his head, oh gosh, he's useful. Man, he's a smart guy. He's really sort of to be able to pick out things like the value of enthusiasm in that particular context, or the nature of the imagination, just what that means for a life. He recognised the importance of connections and relationships. He referred to people who would sort of close themselves off as creating basically a hell of their own making. Heaven and hell were very real, but they were states of mind that we created in this world. We could live in hell quite easily if we just cut ourselves off and locked ourselves in our own, what Robert Ransom Wilson called a reality to our own model of the universe, and believed it to be complete and finite and right and all there is. Once you're just trapped in that. You're just trapped. It's just you need you need. Well, it's that physics thing that in a closed system, entropy can only increase. You need a skylight. You need a little window for transcendence. You need to be aware of that your model is probably flawed and allow a space for what's beyond it to sort of creep in.
So
Blake's great.
You have in Stranger Than Fiction, which is one of my favorite books of yours. That's a history of the.
Stranger Than We Can Imagine.
Oh, sorry. Stranger Than We Can Imagine, is one of my favorite books of yours. It's a history of the 20th century, and that book and The Future Starts Here tell kind of an interesting arc that I'd love if you could, what do you think that is? Sort of going back to, the start of Stranger Than We Can Imagine. What is this arc we're on?
It's what we've been talking about, really. It's about the rise of individualism. But writing the book about the 20th century made it very, very apparent to me. And it sort of framed how I sort of looked at the modern world, because it came from everywhere. It came from science and art and politics. This collapse of this hierarchical way of looking at the world and understanding the world, and there being a fixed truth. I talk a lot about the concept of the omphalos, which is it's the navel of the world, it's the centre of the world, it's the fixed point from which everything sort of makes sense. And the 20th century is a harrowing and violent period in which people realise that, oh no, there isn't actually one omphalos, is it? It's just, if we say it's an omphalos, then sure, but it's not. It's just something we project out on the world. There isn't this actually fixed point from which everything makes sense. And dealing with the sort of horror of that, and that sort of fed into this great sort of rise in the sense of individualism and universal suffrage and democracy, and this move away from empires and Tsars and Kaisers and all those things to Cubism and modernism and all these new ways of finding different perspectives on things. And that sort of shifted into postmodernism, which a lot of people just hated. There was this, especially in the post-war generation, they would get to postmodernism and just be horrified that their particular individualistic perspective wasn't a great universal truth, and they'd just sort of try and retreat, and they'd sort of try and go back to sort of earlier ways of looking at the world. And you see, there's a lot of academics of that particular age who just treat postmodernism as this terrible mistake that we need to sort of recover from and sort of go back. Very few people who sort of went through it and came out the other side, like Robert Anton Wilson did, which is why I admire his writing so much. He took on board why it happened and why it was sort of necessary.
what is this transition now? We go from like, there is this one singular universal truth, the word of kings, God, whoever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The 20th century, relativism gets introduced to absolutely everything. And anything we think we know, we don't know. And now we're in a space of everything is flawed and everything is true, and we're trying to fact check stories, but based on what truth? I mean, where does that put us now?
Now it's not about being right, it's about being less wrong. If we keep trying to be less wrong, that's really our goal. And the notion that, you see it so much on social media, people who have this psychological need to be right and to be seen to be right, because that protects their own internal model of the world, their own particular reality tunnel. If people will agree with them, then that's so sort of pleasing. The idea that we need to sort of synthesize all these different perspectives to get closer to some form of thing that's truer, if not completely true, seems a lot of work for a lot of people. And it's also, it requires a little bit of humbleness, which is a real sticking point for sort of many people. You have to sort of be aware or be so the connection sort of, I'm saying to be sort of, to admit that your one truth is probably as flawed as everybody else's. It's difficult for a lot of people, it's very easy to sort of think, well, my worldview is so self-evidently true that anyone who thinks differently must be wrong. But with the 7 billion people on the planet, no two people agree on everything. No two people will have exactly the same perspective on things. So the chances that you're the one guy, who's got everything right, and the rest are all idiots, mathematically, you've got to see the problem with that. And it's,
maybe in a past world we're aspiring to like a capital T truth, where an institutional truth, a spiritual truth. What is it now instead? Is it like 5 different versions, and we're just counting citations? Where like which has the most people ascribing to those truths? It doesn't matter what the overall truth is. Where does that put us?
It's a lot more practical. It's a lot more what works. It's a lot more. Is anyone hurt by this? Is this doing damage to others? It's those sort of things. But the idea that how true our perspective is what's important isn't really the case. It was like how I was talking earlier about sort of enthusiasm and meaning and our sense of purpose, and whether when we get up in the morning and it's just like, it's just such a fantastic day, and you should just see the way the trees are, at the moment, and to be in a loving relationship and to have friends around you. If you have those sort of things, the fact that your take on politics is the best you can do, but probably flawed, the fact that you don't have an absolute truth, it doesn't matter a huge amount. It's not. It's when you're able to divorce things like that from your sense of identity. That's when you sort of come through it. And this is going back to Robert Anton Wilson, he talks a lot about a state of mind called chapel perilous, which very much describes a lot of people in the sort of the QAnon sort of field in America at the moment. Well, a lot of people beyond that as well. It's that sense where all your sort of maps have run out, and nothing really. You don't know what's right. You don't know what's true. You've lost your North Star. You're just bewildered. You don't know which way to go. Utterly sort of lost. That sort of state of mind, which is, with all the sort of the rise of the sort of post-truth and things like that, sort of fits our current era quite well, I think, and the amount of lies that politicians just come out with fits it all quite well. Robert Anton Wilson would say there's two ways out of that, or there's two ways to deal with that. The first is paranoia, essentially, where you sort of, if you sort of dig your heels in and you desperately cling to your one sort of great truth, the fact that it doesn't chime with the rest of the world can only be explained by everyone else being able to get it. And a lot of people are trying that at the moment, and it just doesn't lead anywhere. It just really doesn't. But the other option is to accept is to be humble, is to accept that you don't have the one great truth. It is to become agnostic. Agnostic not just about God, but agnostic about sort of everything. And once you sort of accept that, then the whole problem just sort of slides away. The issues of life become, as I say, if you've got people around you that you love, if you've got good health, if you're feeling well, if you've got an exciting project, a reason to sort of get up in the morning, if you have an element of transcendence in your life, these are what sort of matters. The need to have this one great truth, this one way of looking at the world that sort of explains everything. You don't need it. You really don't need it. It's all very good, but it's not the way our media is funded. It's not the way our social media algorithms work. They're very much focused on putting up strong opinions that declare themselves to be absolutely true, which then clash with each other. And I'm very pleased that the word doom scrolling has taken off. It's sort of shown that people have become aware of really what they're doing when they're sort of going endlessly sort of through Twitter or Facebook or whatever. They're not learning, they're not coming to the truth, but they're having all their prejudices. Their buttons are pressed, and they're getting angry when they want to get angry. And some people generally get off on that, and they're generally into like really being angry at the world and hating it and things like that. And if that's your thing, then okay, it's none of my business. But there are better ways.
I mean, it's unfortunately, Twitter and the dialogue it has and the people who use it are at the very center of culture and power right now. I mean, that's part of the challenge.
They are until you switch it off and walk away.
Yeah.
And suddenly it's a very different world, and it really doesn't matter so much.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it is you can opt in or opt out of that. But it clearly has a kind of power now.
I mean, definitely, and it is. I mean, I don't have them on my phone or anything like that. I don't completely opt out of these things because you can learn an awful lot about what's going on with the world. But the issue of trust is, I think, a big sort of deal in our current age, and learning who to trust. And being willing to give trust to people whilst sort of keeping an eye on them as a source of sort of information. And people are very much sort of trusting people in their own sort of networks, people they sort of know, much more than they're trusting the voice of the establishment or critics or whatever it sort of used to be. And it can make it hard to accept that the things that the people in your networks are telling you, are bullshit. It can make it hard to do that. I mean, you can see, here in Britain, when we look at America, and we just think, my God, the Republican Party is just a joke. This is just embarrassing. How can they sort of keep sort of supporting Trump's claims that he hasn't won the election? It's just, what the hell is going on? We know what the Republican Party is supposed to stand for. Whether we agree with it or not, we get the ideals behind it. To see what it's sort of become is just insane. But it's hard if you've given trust to something that is untrustworthy to sort of deal with that and accept that and break those connections and sort of move on. It's a very, very sort of difficult thing to do.
How much do you ascribe to, cyclical theories of society? I think about a book called The Fourth Turning. Maybe you've read that, or there's the Schumpeter cycles, theories of every 15 years we move between right and left, and a lot of theories for how generations kind of play off each other. And I wonder what thoughts you have on that, and also maybe, thinking of this as like maybe we're in a place of there is a crisis state or some sort of a lost state, and maybe even like there was a lost generation before, right? There was a generation that had gone through this before. Maybe we could learn something from how people have responded in the past to these sorts of states.
Yeah, I mean, those things can be useful models for understanding the past, but I certainly wouldn't put any faith in them to predict the future. It's much more a maelstrom of chaos in my reading of history, and I think because the changes that we have now are so technologically sort of led or technologically involved, particularly the existence of the internet in our lives. I don't think there's many earlier sort of parts of history that are going to help us model this thing looking forward, really. So, I mean, yeah, they're the sort of thing Steve Bannon believes, They're not the sort of thing I pay much attention to.
So I just read a book called The Upswing by Robert Putnam, who wrote Bowling Alone. And it's a history of America from 1880 to today. And, there's a lot of social histories that start in the 60s today and show the rise of individualism. And this book talks about that. But a significant amount of the book is showing how from 1880 to 1965, there was this great rise of collectivism in America. Mm-hmm. And he sort of traces like the high point of collectivism in America as being 1965. And he points to like Dylan going solo, Dylan going electric and things like that as actually being very important cultural moments to signal like a new value system, a rejection and a shift towards this individualism to where like the real victory of the hippies and the counterculture is actually the individualism of today. And I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I'd probably agree with most of it. I certainly sort of see the link between the hippies and the punks and the Thatcherites in our country or the Reaganites in America. That's all one thing as far as I see. With obvious, examples kicking against the tide, but that's the general flow of individualism. And the rise of the collectivist sort of movements in the early part of the century are also in some ways inspired by this increase in this sense of individualism that came from back in the Age of Enlightenment, in terms of the demand for the vote, the working man's demand to sort of unionise, the rise of things like the Labour Party and the trade union movement and the Chartists as they were over here. This is individuals sort of standing up and being counted in a sort of way that works. So it all sort of fits in. But yeah, it was very much the post-war 1960s era when what was started in the Age of Enlightenment became the mainstream. It was avant-garde, it was radical, but then it was just normal. That's the sort of point.
A question I always find interesting is to think about when considering these longer-term generational changes. Do people actually change their minds, or do people just die? And there's a chart. There's a chart in The Upswing, these two charts side by side, and it shows percentage of Americans who have positive attitudes about gender equality, right? And it's showing a line over the 20th century steadily going up. Yeah. And then it breaks it down and shows here are answers to that question by generation. And it shows that the generation born in 1910, for example, they never changed the perspective on equality. Yeah. And in fact, it went down when the women's rights movement began. But, do people actually change, or is it just that the the attendees of the party keep shuffling, and so the music keeps changing?
The safest answer would be the second. That does seem to be the norm. But I hope there's a way out, because in terms of things like climate change, we do need to get the whole sort of society behind things. Because again, that's the thing that boils down to this sense of individualism. That sense of why I should be able to fly, or I should be able to eat meat, or sort of whatever. You're not sort of thinking about the wider sort of thing in the way that Generation Z do. And certainly here in the UK, the real sort of division in society now is based on age. In the last general election, 2019, it used to be sort of class or wealth or something like that, with wealthier people voting Conservative and working people voting Labour. That used to be the divide. That's just gone now. It's just gone. It's just old people vote Tory, young people vote Labour, and it was the case that the young didn't tend to vote very much. Certainly the millennial generation are sort of notorious for not sort of bothering to sort of vote. But that's completely changing, this shift from millennials to Gen Z. They really can't wait to get in the voting booth. From what I saw of the demographics of the American election, which were often not what people were expecting. There was a sort of shift to Trump in, women and ethnic minorities were shifting to Trump, and white men were sort of shifting more to. People were a bit surprised by all of that. But what swung it for Biden was an increased turnout from ethnic minority voters, which is absolutely brilliant, but also the young. Basically, the young turned up, and the young swung massively to Biden, to the extent that, I don't. People would argue over the maths, but it does start to look that it was thanks to the people that are only just entering the electorate now that we don't have a Trump second term. So,
yeah, I think in both of our, certainly in my book, I take a very optimistic view of the future, in large part because of who these generations are, and I think the nature of the challenges that we face. So, the climate is a collective problem unlike anything we've faced before. However, the internet makes us a collective organism, not that these things become easy, but that the humans are being produced that maybe are most adept at solving where we are.
Yeah, I think that was our real problem, was the assumption that if we say look for down in 2050, the problems would be dealing with then, we would assume that we'd be thinking, like the people of, 2015 or something, and that's how they would look at it, and they would just sort of give up, and they couldn't see any way through it. They were all doomed. That sort of fatalistic pessimism that was sort of around. I think it started to shift. So I'm saying a few years ago, but that was the thing that forced me to write the future book. But that's not the case at all. They will see things very, very differently. They will have very different prejudices and perspectives, and they will come up with answers that those earlier people sort of wouldn't. So that's what gives me hope, I think.
Have you changed your opinions about anything since COVID?
Well, yes, you have to factor in the huge global recession and the incredible waves of unemployment that we're also now going to have to deal with, especially here in the UK. And it does make the argument for basic income much more, or more compelling. That would be my sort of hope, because there's going to be, certainly in this country, there's going to be hundreds of thousands of people losing their livelihoods over the next year, and we need to support those in our circles, those we know, those we can help. That's going to be but we should be doing that anyway. We need to be keeping an eye on people, especially people who've been isolated and friends being lost and isolated. Are they in trouble? Can we help them? if we start to do that more, then that's not a bad thing. That's okay. That's sort of okay.
One of the things I've really appreciated getting to be friends over the past couple of years is learning also how you work, and that you were making children's television and you felt inspired by the KLF book. Was your first book? Is that right? There was something before KLF? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I wrote a book about Timothy Leary in 2005.
Oh, that was, yes.
But, I'd made no money from it, and I was making my living making these little sort of very cheap kids' cartoons. So that I never really felt, I didn't sort of identify as a writer, even though I had a book in the shops, because, it wasn't, I was getting my money elsewhere sort of thing. But I turned 40 and I made the decision that, I need to try. And I was well aware at that point what the economics of publishing was like. But I was also well aware that I just wanted to write. And if I didn't, I would become bitter. And it was sort of, trade would I be happier being bitter or being penniless? And in which case, penniless wins every single time. So I thought, right, I will attempt to be a writer, and it's worked so far. Still, still got a roof over my head, still working out okay. But it was a real leap of faith to do that.
And once you finish a book, you mentioned you just immediately start the next one, right? I mean, it's just sort of
pretty much.
It's nonstop. Yeah.
No, I mean, sometimes I'll paint a room in the house.
You make a cup of tea, yeah, sure.
It's like it really needs it, You've got to sort that sort of stuff out. Doing something physical, but there's always the next. You always know what the next one is. You're writing this one, but they're sort of building behind you. Do you have I'm a few books ahead? What's on the shelves? Put it that way.
And you have like a set writing hours, set reading research hours? Like how do you use your time, or your brain? How does your brain work?
It's they're not set. I'm not because life interferes, and you flow with what the demands of the day are, really. But you still have a word count that you need to hit every day. You do need to sort of set word counts. You do need to achieve them. You do need to spend the hours at the keyboard and at the library and reading. All has to be done. But you're fortunate enough to be able to sort of fit around, other things, and you sort of know what you're capable of, and you know how much you can sort of get done. So you don't, you're not strict, but you do it. That's the way.
One of my favorite ideas I learned about in the book was, and the future starts here, was half Earth. I had not heard of half Earth before. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah. Well, it's due to the huge collapse in biodiversity. You can feel very, very hopeless that nature's sort of doomed. But that's sort of been countered with this shift to rewilding. Are you familiar with rewilding? Do I need to explain that? I don't think I need to explain that.
Yeah, I know what that is. Yeah.
Yeah, people know it now. When I was writing the book, sort of people didn't. And there's been such wonderful sort of success stories of people just leaving land alone, and not putting pesticides on it, not putting fungicides on it, making sure it's got the right sort of key species. A lot of work goes into getting something that you can sort of leave it alone. But the way nature just comes roaring back is just astounding. Just in a few years, you stop thinking. Environmentalism had sort of pushed you into thinking that nature was this sort of weak, sort of pathetic thing that needs us to sort of help it and save it because it's too frail. Rewilding shows that really isn't the case. If we get out of the way, nature just comes back like anything. It's just extraordinary. And what it needs is space. And the half-Earth idea is about increasing the amount of space given over to nature to about half the planet, which sounds insane when you first read it, but it's something like sort of 17% at the moment, but it is increasing. And it's a way of thinking about environmental problems instead of just being a whole bunch of battles that are lost. Which is, terrible things happen there, terrible things happen there. The slow increase in the amount of the land and the oceans that are just left alone is constant little victory, constant little victory, constant little victory. Here in the UK, there's not many good things coming out of the Brexit vote that I'm aware of, that I can see. But one thing is the EU would give money to landowners if their land was capable of being farmed. Didn't even have to be farmed, but if it was capable of being farmed, you got a lot of money. So a lot of people, a lot of rich people would just buy up, land, and it would pay for itself. And it was a bit of a corrupt sort of system, and it wasn't good for small farmers, and it wasn't good for the land or anything like that. So now that's gone. The system is landowners will get money if they do improve the soils, or they do rewilding, or they do some carbon drawback, or they sort of grow forests, or if they do things that are positive to the greater good, I think is the exact wording, but environmentally or for the local population. They have to do these things, to get these money. So the amount of space is being given over to nations, the amount of carbon drawback that this sort of increases, the quality, importance of things like soils and things like that, and how this goes on to affect things like flooding, and the hugely complicated sort of things. But it's just, that's the thing that's really starting to sort of move in the right direction.
Yeah.
And you don't see many stories about this in the main press because it's not scary and terrible. But if you sort of subscribe to, there's a website called Future Crunch, which I quite like, which sends you out an email about all the positive news stories that aren't in the newspapers. And the amount of really positive schemes that are occurring at the moment is just incredible. It's not been, getting enough attention or fanfares, but it's very helpful.
So I'm going to read here. This is from the very end of The Future Starts Here. You write, "This is the last stand of the individualistic, fundamentalist, single-vision philosophy. The young are watching this play out. They are not seeing anything that appeals. They're not seeing anything that works. Sometimes a virus has to run its course before you can be cured. Some ideologies need to reach their failed, absurd ends before we can get them out of our system. This is how we create the antibodies that will protect us from that virus in the future. That's what's happening now. It's not fun, but it's probably necessary." So, are you the coronavirus? Is my main question.
I personally, I don't claim to be the coronavirus. It was 2018 I wrote that or something like that, and after lockdown, the amount of people who would read that at the very end of the book, Jesus Christ, did seem incredibly pathetic. That sounds like me. Yeah, but not the coronavirus, alas.
But you feel that we are at an epochal shift, and you felt that before COVID, and certainly you feel the same now, as do I. Yeah.
Definitely, that doesn't mean it's all going to be good from now on. Things are never good or just bad. They're always complicated sort of mess that you have to sort of make your way through. I went to recommend Kim Stanley Robinson's last book, The Ministry of the Future, to you. I don't know if you've read any Kim Stanley Robinson. But he sort of writes about the next 30, 40 years in a novel till we reach a point where, we've got the whole carbon thing is sort of sorted. Fantastically, really interesting, very science-based sort of writer, and it's not a fun, journey. It's not a fun path. It sort of starts with a major heat wave in northern India, where the temperature goes above the wet bulb temperature of 35, and the air's so humid that you can't sweat. And basically, it's too hot, and people just die. And 20 million people die in this this heat wave in northern India at the start of this book, and it's horribly plausible. You know, really, you know, it's not a wild card suggestion what he's sort of making there, and it does take really shocking things like this to make people change, and it also takes a lot of violence, terrorism. You know, there's a moment when a whole bunch of private jets are taken out at the same time by drones, and no one ever admits who did it, but the message is understood. You know, it sort of tackles that question of, you know, at what point is it still safe for billionaires to walk down the street, considering what's being done to the sort of climate. So it looks at all these sort of things, and as it happens, you know, he finds a path through. It's not all roses and you know, jolly positive rainbows or anything like that. But there is a path through. Just knowing that there is a path through changes your entire sort of perspective on these things.
That's excellent. Yeah, it's going to be my holiday read, so I'm excited. Mm-hmm. So I have a lightning round here of 5 last questions, and okay, question 1: who broke up the Beatles?
John.
All right. I like the long pause. Question 2.
There's a lot to consider.
There's a lot to consider. Can you walk us through just a couple of the things you considered in that pause?
The relationship between Paul and John, and what happened in India that changed John from writing songs like Mother Nature's Son to you know, Your Blues. Something strange happened between the pair of them in India. Anyway, that's too much to go into here.
Question 2: top 3 solo Beatles albums.
All Things Must Pass, Chaos and Creation in the Backyard. I would say The Fireman, but that's Youth and Paul McCartney. Does that not count as a solo?
That can count. I think that counts, yeah.
Yeah, Rush's by Fireman.
Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah.
Broad one, but Great Britain.
Yeah.
What is your take on Great Britain right now?
That's quite a long one to sort of go into. But as we were saying earlier, you know, it's Monty Python. Right? We're Monty Python. We're that knight. You know that knight who it's for the flesh wound. That's us, right? But to make it funnier, there's this layer at the top that don't know, right? And they're sent to special schools to believe that they're not that, which is what makes it really, really funny. That's brilliant.
Great. Bentoism.
Yeah, I should ask you more about that. How's that going? I mean, just the notion of a framework for making better long-term decisions is such a welcome and wonderful sort of thing. I heartily applaud everything you're doing. I hope it's going well. It is,
and you know, it is explicitly a frame that's meant to extend self-interest to the future and to a collective beyond the individual. Mm-hmm. So it's trying to create a new sort of multi-dimensional definition of self, and so I feel like it's very much a, you know, it fits your thesis. Like to me, this feels like one of the kinds of things that is going to happen that will be a part of some outcome. You know,
it feels the right thing for now. That it's certainly not swimming against the tide. It's absolutely the right thing for the direction we're moving in.
Yeah.
I think.
So very last one, fill in this blank. The 21st century will be.
Doesn't need another word. 21st century will be. It's what we make of it. It's how we sort of deal with living in it. That's all the fun thing. But the 21st century will definitely be.
Wonderful. You know, I've gotten, of course, so much out of your books. You know, just so insightful, and you know, the KLF book is My best friend gave it to me saying, here's the little yellow book. And, my newsletter, The Idea Space, takes its name from, the concept you write about there. And so I just can't, I can't express enough gratitude for the ideas you shared and for getting to know you these past few years.
Oh, that's very kind. That's very kind.